is Susanna Roberts, and a bunch of us were talking as part of an invisible group that we wanted to have a town hall to talk to our state senator and state representative to know what was going on at the State House, because we're feeling a little out of the loop. So we sent it around to everybody that is a constituent of their towns, and they obliged quickly. It was very nice. So they have a unique situation because they are elected to lead, but they are also elected to serve us. So it's this, a give and take, and it's up to us to inform them on what's on our mind. And the fact that they're here shows that they're willing to do that. And right now, because of what's happening nationally, there's a lot of unease, a lot of worry, and not so much an unsurety of what's coming down the road. And so, they're limited by their jurisdiction, which is Massachusetts and the towns. But what we're asking tonight are, what steps is the state Congress, the legislature, what are they doing to ensure that our rights, our constitutional rights, both in the state and the U.S. Constitution, are being protected? How do we know the state's going to be looking out for us? And not only just for us as residents, but also the state as a whole, the state's sovereignty. We have rights as a state that the federal government can't breach. So it's going to be a Q&A, but before we get to that, I'm thinking maybe you can tell us what's happening right now in the State House that you're working on. I know that there was recently some legislation passed to protect schools, churches, hospitals. So just tell us, when does that go into effect? How is that going to be enforced? What other things are happening that we don't know about? And then if we run out of that and we still have time, we can talk about other things.
So I'm Robin Kennedy. I'm the state senator for the 1st Worcester District. I represent about 60% of the city of Worcester. And then I also represent the towns of Berlin, Bolton, Northborough, West Boylston, and Boylston. Try to start with the ones over here.
So I represent the 12th Worcester District, so that includes Berlin, of where we are here right now. And I also share Boylston and a precinct in Northborough with Senator Kennedy. I also represent the towns of Clinton, Lancaster, and Sterling, which is a little bit down, 62. So.
And she's Representative Meg Kilcoyne.
Yes, and my name is Meg Kilcoyne.
So we're always happy to join you and share, as much information as we can. So we appreciate the invitation. And I think, when I thought Suzanne was going to say when she said we're in a unique position, I would say it's because of two things that, we have to be very clear about at this point in time. One, these are not normal times. So there's not, the federal government is not following federal law. So we have to look at the world we're in the context of these aren't normal times. And at the same time, federal law supersedes state law. So we have parameters in terms of what we can do to be able to protect our residents, but that doesn't mean we can't do anything, nor does that mean that because we're in not normal times, do we need to be leading and pushing the boundaries and setting clear expectations and where we stand as a state. As far as I'm concerned, from my perspective, I believe this is not a system that can be reformed or trained. I think we need to abolish ICE. We need our Congress, because clearly the president's not going to do that. We need our Congress to step up. Of course, here in Massachusetts, we're very fortunate. Our members of Congress are very actively working and trying to find ways to use parliamentary measures and other strategies to be able to hold the Republican Congress who's in leadership accountable, as well as the president. But short of us being able to outright abolish ICE, there's certain measures that we have taken and that we need to continue to take. So one thing I will note, a law that passed back in November made it a state law to impersonate, made it against state law, state crime, to impersonate law enforcement, including federal law enforcement. We know one of the early kind of crises we were facing is that ICE is not showing up identifying themselves. They're not showing up in a way to distinguish themselves as who they are, and almost everything they're wearing can be purchased on Amazon. With this new state law, it gives local and state law enforcement the ability to aid residents when you see people that are not identifying themselves, to be able to hold them accountable, to be able to question who they are and collect that information for us. Now, can they then stop an operation? No, but they can at least help residents understand who it is. I think there's been, at least a dozen bills that have been filed in the legislature, some that have been around for many years, including making Massachusetts a sanctuary state. And then there are some that have been filed up until a couple weeks ago to protect individuals as they're going into court. That was recently filed, everything from prohibiting the use of masks to creating funding for immigrants because immigration is a civil matter, not a criminal matter. Immigrants aren't given the right to an attorney like you are in a criminal matter. So there's some legislation that would do that and create funding to be able to pay for that, which we actually included to the tune of $5 million in the budget this year. The governor continued it, so I think we'll continue it, certainly if the budget goes through the legislature. So again, speaking to some things we can do. What you probably saw, and I want to distinguish a little bit about what you noted, is the governor took action last week, pulling from a lot of the bills that have already been filed. And I do want to say, I think there's a lot of these issues that we maybe should have acted on before now, but require critical thinking to them that aren't necessarily as straightforward as you might think it makes sense, right? I know, like, for example, there's a lot of conversations about eliminating the 287G agreements for detainment in terms of, and there's only one for folks that don't know in Plymouth County right now. If that was to go away, which some argue that it should, if that was to go away, anyone that was being detained would automatically get sent out of state or held at the ICE facility in Burlington, which, from what I understand, is not a great place to be held. And so there's balance. I say that as just not to give a right or wrong on it, but to give a sense that these aren't easy, straightforward answers, and that's part of the Sanctuary Cities bill.
This term sanctuary state, sanctuary cities, has been thrown around for like a decade, has been weaponized by Republicans for years, and they've called us that since 2016 when the Supreme Court came down with the Lund decision that stipulated that local law enforcement cannot hold anybody based solely on an immigration detainer or immigration status. The reason I say that in Massachusetts, yes, in 2016, which is why I think this speaks to the complexities of what we're talking about, because it doesn't mean that you cannot be arrested on other criminal pretexts. So if you were speeding and the police pulls you over on a speeding ticket and they see that you have an immigration detainer, then what? Because suddenly that creates a pretext for holding you. I mean, this gets into Fourth Amendment stuff, this gets into constitutional rights, but the sanctuary city term, the only reason, and I'm not trying to disagree with you there, I'm only pointing that out, that the Republicans for decades before, even, not decades maybe, but like 10 years before Trump, they are trying to weaponize that as a term for Massachusetts, which, I don't know why, because being a sanctuary, I don't think is a bad thing. But it does speak to, there's not really we're in a legal gray area, I think, in a lot of ways here when it comes to some of this stuff.
That there's different layers, like the Lund decision speaks to the fact that you can't detain someone based solely on their immigration status.
Right.
However, what the other component is partnerships between law enforcement and ICE that says that they will hold people in detainment there are ICE beds, essentially.
You get picked up for being drunk, and you could be held and they could call up ICE to come and deport you, depending on what jurisdictions you are, because some cities and towns have local ordinances that dictate how law enforcement can interact with ICE.
And I do want to speak to, because some of that was referenced in what the governor did last week, which is, again, two parts, and especially to your timing question. She both filed an executive order, which goes into effect right away, and then she also filed legislation. So in her executive order, which is good, she said no more 287G agreements with any state agency unless there's some expedient public safety measure, but no more 287G agreements with any state agency. She also prohibited ice and staging on any state property. And then in her legislation that she filed, which she filed it in a SUP bill, which also makes it a little nuanced because it's a funding bill, it's a supplemental budget bill, that she filed these other pieces as part of outside sections too, which is good because that means hopefully it'll move quickly because it's a funding bill, but it's also a little bit more convoluted and kind of talking, it's not going to be a straightforward bill that comes out that speaks solely to immigration. In that legislation that she filed, includes what's known as sensitive spaces, which used to be federal policy that the Trump administration got rid of, that they will not go into churches, courthouses, schools, and we know that he overturned that. So this would then say these are back to being sanctuary places here in Massachusetts. Sensitive places. Don't want to confuse terms. They're sensitive places. And then, so ICE would not be able to enter those spaces without a judicial warrant. Contrary to what he's saying. So
I honestly, in some ways, I don't even know what to say. Seeing what we've all witnessed on social media, on the news, I don't think I ever thought I'd see that happen in this country. A few years ago, I got to go to Northern Ireland with my family, and we went to Derry, which is also known as Londonderry, but the whole history of that city is it's a city in Northern Ireland that experienced military occupation in the 60s and 70s. And I kept thinking about that because I went to the museum there, and you learn about Bloody Sunday, and you learned about the British military planting bullets in the pockets of the people that they shot dead. And you learned about the generations that had to live under British military occupation and what that left for them. There are people that grew up under that are still suffering higher rates of depression, still suffering higher rates of suicide, still suffering higher rates of homelessness, of joblessness. The inequity is real. And I remember thinking, and this was in 2017, so it wasn't even that long ago, that, wow, that's awful. And thank God that would never happen in the United States. And yet we're seeing it happen on our TV screens right now. I never thought we would see an American city occupied in the way that we're seeing right now by our own government. The British government did apologize and admit wrong, I think roughly in 2015, so 30 plus years later. But all that is to say that I didn't even know what to say about Alex Pretty's murder, about Renee Good's murder. The only thing I knew what to say is just utter disbelief. Words that I wouldn't say, especially with a camera on me right now. And I do think I do feel a huge responsibility of being careful with what I say and being careful of being truthful of what we can and cannot do, of how we can keep our own residents safe. I'll start with sort of maybe, I don't want to even say it's bad news, but I guess the bad news is that I don't know what the answers are right now in terms of what we're going to do as a state. The good news is, the positive news is that these are active conversations that are happening right now in the House, in the Senate, and from the administration. I think all of us are trying to figure out what is the best and most effective path forward that's going to actually keep the people that are in harm's way the safest possible, that are going to keep our residents safe. But I think we're still all trying to navigate what those answers are going to look like. We can get into a little bit of the details of sort of, I know the Senate's having conversations on certain proposals. The House is also sort of navigating those ones right now. So while I can't stand here before you all and say, like, I know we're going to do X, Y, Z, what I can say is that this is something that I think everybody's taking really seriously. I think the fact that we're having this conversation here is really important. I don't think people always think of Central Mass as a place where immigration policy is something that's at the forefront of voters' minds, despite the fact we have a lot of communities where immigrants are living among us and living with us. But it's important to have these everywhere in the state. So I guess I want to make sure that this is a dialogue, so we can have back and forth, we can answer questions. I'll just briefly get into just some recent things that are happening in the House. I think, Senator, you covered a lot of the stuff the administration did already really effectively. The House, I know, the Black and Latino Caucus last week had a press release.
Which is also in the Senate, just to
Yes, sorry.
Senate
No.
and House members. So sorry.
Was it both? Was it bipartisan?
Yeah,
Okay.
bicameral.
Bicameral.
Yeah.
Sorry. So
I don't know about bipartisan, but it was bicameral.
it was bicameral. The Black and Latino Bicameral Caucus came out with a proposal last week called the Protect Act. A lot of that is focused on some courthouse safety stuff, ways that we can make sure people that are in the courthouses are safe, how we can best, it incorporates some of the stuff with the 287G agreements. It's a little distinct from the Safe Communities Act, which is another proposal out there, as well as something called the Deportations Without Dignity Act, which is another proposal. But I know in the House this week, actually Wednesday, we're having member-wide meetings on immigration policy with leadership, with every Democratic member of the House. So those are going to be, I'll know a little bit more, I think, at the end of this week, maybe where the temperature is, but that's an important step in terms of recognizing that this is an important agenda item. This is an important conversation happening not just here, but across the Commonwealth and a lot of people's districts, and something that I think we need to do. So
to follow up, when we were talking about the new legislation that Governor Healy has just enacted, how would any violation of that be enforced? Would it just be after the fact of the lawsuit, or would it be actual law enforcement preventing it from happening?
So here's the tricky part, the tricky answer to that is when it's a state law, then local and state law enforcement are obliged to arrest anybody that's violating state law. I go back to my first comment, we are not in normal times, and police are trained to work with law enforcement at every level. That's how they're programmed, and they're also trained and programmed not to interfere with federal law enforcement. And so that is something, and I know because we've been in conversation with the Worcester Police Department and others, that they're looking for guidance from the Attorney General and from the state, from the governor, which hasn't come down yet, to say, this is the leverage you have, this is the coverage you have, this is the extent that if anybody is violating these orders, that you have to act on it.
I would imagine that given there was a very public press conference, I should say, about this, that, they're not going to want to just, take their time putting this guidance down. They're going to need to be very clear about what these new executive orders mean. And if they fail to do that, then that's going to lead to questions that, just from a governance standpoint, you don't want to see happen. So I'm sure it's something we're all going to be looking at closely and making sure that, we'll start hearing if there's a lack of follow through on the governor's part. But I would imagine if I'm Governor Healy, I don't want to just not do anything after having a very public press conference about it. Exactly. Yeah.
And the chiefs of police, there's the Chiefs of Police Association, so they're working together, so sharing information and coordinating.
So my understanding is that the local police can go up to people that have no identification that seem to be rounding up someone and ask for their ID. Do they have to share that information with the person that's being arrested so that their family has some idea of who took them or where they might be going?
So, not necessarily. They don't have to share necessarily any information on any investigation of any crime. But I think part of what this says is that local law enforcement has to be able to validate that whatever is happening is a federal enforcement, operation and not, which they often are aware of or become aware of. So I think this would fall into the specifics of it within the guidance from the Attorney General. The other thing that was pointed out to us today is that there's a big difference between somebody who's seeking, like an individual that's pretending to be a law enforcement officer, maybe to kidnap somebody who, and assault them or something, versus when it's a law enforcement, when it's ICE, they're usually in large numbers. And so it's a little bit, and they are usually somewhat aware that is what is happening in the area.
I also think it's important to clarify that there is a difference between state law enforcement and federal law enforcement. we don't have jurisdiction over what federal law enforcement does, or limited, I should say. And there are certain resources out there where if you are an undocumented person, you can have, there are certain rights that you, constitutional rights that you do have regardless of immigration status. So for instance, typically or historically, ICE has needed a warrant to deport somebody or arrest someone. And if they do not have one, you are within your rights to demand to see one or call legal representation. We have seen some troubling reports where, and this might fall under Border Patrol rather than ICE, which, I don't want to get in the weeds of this, but I know there is a distinction between the two agencies, that they're going to suspend that requirement, which I don't understand is constitutional. Again, I hope that's false, but this is kind of the chaos that we're currently dealing with. When it comes to local, state, or municipal law enforcement, most, and I don't want to speak for all, but I believe, and I don't hold me to this, but I believe, state police, for instance, they're not necessarily going to ask about or inquire about your immigration status. A lot of cities and towns in Massachusetts already have that as a policy, in part because they are literally trying to police communities where there's a large immigrant population and where they want to be able to interact with locals to get a better sense of, what is happening in the neighborhood and what's going on. So they don't want to necessarily always inquire about that. That could vary from town to town or municipality. There has been some efforts at the state level to have like a statewide bill that would cover all of that. That's been around for a long time, actually, since the Obama years. I think there's been it hasn't gotten over the finish line. I don't know. Again, this is part of the conversations, though, that I think we're all going to have in terms of what is going to be the most effective state policy we can do that's going to lead to the safest outcomes. But I just wanted to make sure to clarify that when it comes to inquiring about your status as a citizen, we have seen reports of that happening in Minnesota. It's not something, though, that typically happens with law enforcement here, or at least with state and municipal law enforcement. And I know historically, even with ICE, as it's operated in Massachusetts, they have needed to have warrants, judicial warrants.
The state AG has posted online a document that lists the rights for immigrants and their families and what have you. It's about 7 pages. It's pretty readable. You can download it.
And what is that, AG?
The state attorney general.
It seems that it's the federal law that goes against what I understand the Constitution says.
Yeah.
And I guess 5 or 10 years ago I would have said, well, it would be individual states that would muck up, But now it's the state is trying to say, well, the Constitution says the person in the car, in his home, is safe. Mm-hmm. And it's not longer any true. And so I guess one of the things I had in my mind was, is there a one place where we can go on the internet to find out what is the latest in this chaos?
This is complicated because some of it is tied up in the United States Supreme Court, right? Like when we're talking about constitutional violations, there's two ways this could get, because we're supposed to have a government that checks and balances, and we're sort of in a place right now where that is lopsided very much at the federal level. Ideally, if you had the federal government that was, as I think we've seen evidence of, violating constitutional rights of individuals and U.S. citizens, you have two ways that this would be checked. One would be Congress stepping in and say, what's going on? We're going to start doing investigations and threaten. This is where impeachment threats would come into play, right? That's not going to happen, I don't think, at least until 2026, God willing. The other way that this would be checked is if there's a lawsuit filed that would go up to the federal courts, either the district courts or the U.S. Supreme Court that would rule that the federal government has violated constitutional rights. They're actually. I was reading this today. I might actually post it so people read it, because as I said earlier, it's like hard to not get emotional about some of the stuff we're talking about. This is a 3-page court ruling that came down regarding Minnesota violations that I briefly skimmed it. I didn't have time to read it in total, but it's 3 pages, so anyone can read it. Really sums up what's happening. The federal Border Patrol has violated so many court orders And it basically says nobody is entitled to act unto a law unto itself. And it really does outline, I think, what's at stake. So those are the two ways typically you would see the federal government being reined in. To your point, historically, we've usually seen the states kind of playing, violating constitutional rights where the federal government was able to step in. So this is a bit unique in that we're seeing unchecked power. But yeah.
I think maybe kind of segueing, because I know this was one of the questions you sent into advance, and to talk a little bit about kind of what can we do collectively in this moment. And I want to kind of take a step back, looking, at our room here tonight, looking at our, communities like Berlin and Bolton, which are majority white, right? And, it starts by kind of naming the truth about things. We say the names Renee Good and Alex Preddy, but we also need to talk about Keith Porter, right? A black man who was just killed by ICE. Also 40 plus individuals that have been killed by ICE or in ICE detainment. Most of them people of color, Latino individuals that have been killed. And so, we need to name that and talk about that and talk about why we named Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And I think, I would say, adding on something like that Rep. Kilcoyne said, the truth is America has been here before, right? We keep referring to ICE as, Nazis in Nazi Germany. They're closer to slave patrols, right? That were sent out to kidnap freed or escaped slaves. And so I think it's important on us, particularly those that carry privilege, a lot of privilege in this moment, to name that and to talk about that, and to talk about what we can do to protect those in our communities that don't carry that. And we saw that with Renee Good and Alex Preddy. But we have to be able to talk, be honest about this moment, because, we're already in a moment of racial reckoning coming up to this. Even in the most recent years, we've seen, not to this extent, but this is not new in black communities, right, being gunned down by law enforcement. And so I think this is something that, again, we need to keep having these kinds of conversations with each other. I think a lot of indivisible groups are connected in with an organization called LUCE, LUCE. I brought a couple cards with their hotline number, which I can share, but we can certainly get more. I encourage, so they're a statewide network of trained, and I emphasize that, trained volunteers who are observers and verifiers, who, when anyone in a community, and we see them a lot in some of the bigger cities, when somebody calls the hotline and says, I see some what looks like federal agents in this neighborhood, they will send out verifiers who will go down, and they're trained to know what to look for. They're trained how to observe safely and record and get information and try to get the person's name if they're being taken away, so that they can then follow up. They do a lot of kind of mutual aid work after somebody is kidnapped, to help their family that's left behind, or help get connected with whether it's services for the family or whether it's, bond or something like that the individual might need. And anybody can get trained as a volunteer in the network. And so if you have time, if you have the capacity to be a verifier and to be an observer, again, nobody, including myself, would suggest to intervene or put yourself into the middle of a situation. But it's so important right now that we're recording. We know what happened we know what's happening in Minneapolis because people are recording it and documenting it. And it's not to that scale, but it's happening in our communities. ICE is here, right? They're in our communities. And so these verifiers and observers are going out to help document it. And again, because now we're seeing a lot where it's, over the summer it was the USDA that was checking trees for bugs, but they're government cars. So people were calling saying, we think, there's government agents going door to door. There's a lot of times where it's actually a local police effort that's happening or operation that's happening. And so these verifiers are able to say to the community, no, we know it's the police, or we know it's actually just people looking for bugs in trees, and sharing that information. And so, again, something that we can all do, because in all these low points in our history, it has been residents. I mean, we certainly as elected officials in this moment of time have an obligation like nothing we've seen in my recent history, but certainly in our collective recent history, we have an obligation, but it's always been the residents, it's always been the community that stepped up, protected each other, and pushed for the change that we need to see. So I encourage, like I said, we can give out some of the numbers, but to both call if you see something that's questionable. You see somebody that might be in risk, so that somebody who's trained can go out and verify and get that person's information. And then also to be able to record and document. So, or become a trained observer yourself. So,
I had a friend that just went through that training, and they said it was very helpful and surprising, because I think, for instance, what you said about like Minnesota, we've seen a lot of people with whistles. I believe they recommend you not do that, because there's, you don't want to instigate, you don't want to cause more chaos than is necessary, or endanger anybody, or get in the way of anything that could cause anyone harm, including those that you're trying to help. So I've heard good things about it. Mira is also another resource that that has a great roundup of existing policy, both in Massachusetts and federally, as well as updates on legislative action that's happening. MIRA, so Massachusetts Immigrants and Refugee, I believe Massachusetts Immigration and Refugee Association. So a nice kind of roundup of what's going on in Massachusetts as well.
They have some nice PDFs on their page.
Yeah.
Different languages.
Yeah. Great way to get some information quickly, or print out information if you need it. So if anyone needs a link to that, we're happy to give you those links if you can't remember Mira or have trouble finding it, because federal government.
now, ironically, the Republicans pushed for businesses to be able to use their own religious beliefs to discriminate against other entities or people. So if a hotel decided they didn't want to serve, or a restaurant or business, they're protected in saying, that they have the right as a private entity not to
There's
serve.
pretty good U.S. Supreme Court law that a hotel can say no.
And that was due to,
That's
I think the spirit of your question, though, is important.
yeah.
Like, what are the creative
What are the
ways?
creative ways to make your life hard that are legal?
Well, and I think, so there are, I think this making it a state crime to impersonate, that wasn't a direct tie to ICE agents. That's another tool for, now there's follow-up questions and we need to talk about enforcement, but it was designed as not giving another tool to local law enforcement to be able to make it more difficult so that they can't just wander the streets masked in non-identifying information, outfits, I guess you call them costumes, whatever you want to call them. Yeah. But I think, I think that's where, we're always open to what are these nuanced situations that we can, one of the things that's tricky is with the cars that you mentioned, they use a rotating fleet of cars. So it's not, so there's not they're not driving through town with
Do we require rental companies to report their rentals so that we can track them?
Well, there's a program that's in solidarity with Minnesota, and they're actually boycotting a lot of the organizations or companies that made it possible for ICE to stay there. And a couple of them are Delta Airlines, the Hilton.
Yes.
Just one.
Hilton Hotels, Delta Airlines, Econo, I think it's Econo, Farmhouse. You can boycott the companies that are servicing that. Enterprise?
Home Depot and Target
Yes.
somehow are in there.
the traveling.
Home Depot's in there because they allow them to pick up people in their parking lots daily.
Target allows them to stage their vehicles for raids in their parking lots.
And then there have been a couple of wins too for Avello Airlines and Spotify. Was a big campaign, for their Spotify accounts. And it's very effective. You have to look the information up so that you can participate.
I mean, I think this speaks to what the senator was saying, that, I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't be looking legislatively at creative ways that we can address this problem, but some of it is going to be citizen driven. Like, we as a state in Massachusetts, we have a limited ability to regulate interstate commerce, right? Like, we are still under the Constitution, one country. And so it gets tricky in terms of regulating things that go beyond our state boundaries and our state lines. So we are working within the confines of what we legally and constitutionally can do as a state. How much we can push on that, we don't know. But I mean, we also are dealing with the 10th Amendment. Federal government supersedes state law. And so we have some limitations on how we can operate. And you even saw in Minnesota, I think Mayor Frey was asked about whether or not he was in his authority to arrest Border Patrol agents for violating the law. And his answer was yes. But we have 600 officers to 2,000 agents, and what is that going to lead to? So there's some practicalities that we have to take into consideration, including that of you don't want to put anybody in a position that you can't actually follow through with. So, I mean, this is why it's important to have these town halls. It is important to get ideas, and it's not to say we shouldn't consider all of them, but what is it that's going to keep everybody as safe as possible?
Right.
Yeah, Representative Kent, I want to step away from what, the consumer sorts of citizen stuff you can do and come back to the legislature in Massachusetts. And specifically back to the acts the pieces that are now pending. And I think it was Suzanne's question is, well, how do we enforce? And I want to make some comments, but then put the question out. And the comment I have is the ICE and or Border Patrol saying, oh, we can enter your home with an administrative warrant, which is not what the Constitution says.
Yeah.
Fourth Amendment. And the
Very
Bill of
intentional.
Rights in the United States Constitution applies to all people, not citizens, people.
Yep.
State constitution as well.
Thank you. I was just curious
Yep.
about that. So they both do. So what we have is we have a policy statement by none other than Todd Lyons,
Yep.
who used to head ICE in Boston. Do I have the name right, Lyons?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so he issued that policy, so it's out of, I'm not going to mention the body part, but the law is you have to have a judicial warrant to enter a place, a private dwelling, a business, to apprehend somebody. You cannot go in, and that's, and this policy that's been stated is contrary. It will not stand in court. But now we have, I'm thinking about our police force, and I'll speak to the candidate here in Berlin. I think we have really well trained, certainly in the local setting here, police. I don't know about state police, I'll leave that to somebody else, but we have really well trained police in this state, good community policing going on. So I'm very sympathetic to these people. What did they do? The Worcester Police Department last summer, that was an awful situation. So as we draft legislation, are we paying attention to keeping some bright line zones where a Massachusetts police officer knows this is my line? And I think you have that with a judicial warrant versus an administrative warrant. They know what to do, and we have the Massachusetts Supreme Court case that says you can't get involved in this unless there's a judicial warrant.
Right.
Are we paying attention to that as we draft the legislation so that we're giving our law enforcement people clear guidance with these protections? I mean, if we say you can't ICE, the state law is you're not allowed to come into a school, a church, a state building. If ICE has a judicial warrant to go in that building, what are the police supposed to do? They can't stop them, right? So I'm challenging both of you to say, are we looking at the legislation to understand how it's going to play out for these law enforcement people on our streets that are actually trying to protect us?
I mean, I think the answer is, I would say comfortably yes, in that we're gonna, in the House and Senate, look at these bills carefully, and we're certainly gonna get input from the law enforcement community on what they feel they can and can't do. In addition to that, I've tried, I think somewhat successfully, to cultivate a relationship with our local law enforcement here, and figuring out, like, from both a broader perspective, but also locally, like, what is it you're seeing on the ground right here in this community? Like, I've had conversations with, our local law enforcement on other policies that have done. We did a big gun bill a couple years ago, and I had conversations about that with our local law enforcement. So I would hope to have those again. But I mean, I think we always want to take into account, if we're passing a law that will instruct a certain agency or group to do something, they will give us feedback, good or bad. Yeah.
And I think, I keep going back to, and I think we have to recognize it for law enforcement, local and state law enforcement as well. These are not normal circumstances. I mean, what you just described is federal policy that's in violation of the federal Constitution. Like, that's not, because that would, in theory, rely on the federal government to enforce. Like, a municipal police officer doesn't, it's not normal for them to have to enforce, you know, the federal government breaking federal law.
Yeah.
And it's the government directing the federal agent. So I think that, you know, what we're trying to navigate is in that, how are we as creative as possible within the bounds? And some of it may be, and like we've seen in other states, testing some of those bounds, right? Like, see what holds up in court of us putting into state law that adds some pressure or changes. You know, I think that there's got to be some, you know, some of this we could get challenged on, even with the governor, you know, put out an executive order. She says you can't use state property to stage an immigration raid. What if they do? So then if there's going to be that challenge. We're going to, you know, see how the federal government, you know, reacts, and how do we, now do they listen to that? Do they then go across the street to the Target parking lot and use that instead? Do they, you know, so.
Well, isn't some of this problem too that these federal immigration enforcement people are not talking to local?
Correct.
And so therefore, how can you have that? You can't have that dialogue until the event is happening. Now you're in direct conflict. And
This kind of speaks to the complicated nuance of the conversation, because we have bills that are saying we tell our local law enforcement don't talk to them, but then do you want them to, right? Like, this is what I'm saying. It's like,
be pragmatic. Think about these people walking in their shoes.
and I think it's
what you're making them do.
And that's why we want to, I think, this is where it's important, I think, to your overall point, is it's not just about us going to Beacon Hill and putting out legislation. We have to hear from everybody what's going to make them the most safe. Like, I remember when I first got elected in 2020, so I was sworn in 2021. I think this happened right before you got in, but this was right after the first Trump administration. So President Biden had just been elected. And there was a big push to pass the Workers' Mobility Act. And that was a bill that was allowing undocumented individuals to get a driver's license. And I remember having a conversation with an immigration advocate, because prior to getting elected, there was a lot of conversations about the Safe Communities Act. And the feedback I got from people that were in contact with immigration groups was that the big priority was the Workers' Mobility Act, because that was seen as a more effective way to keep people safe. Because if you had a driver's license, you wouldn't have to worry about getting pulled over for a traffic violation or not having a license, and then that leading to a complication with your immigration status. So this is why my point of that story is that I think another important group we want to make sure we're hearing from is what policy is actually going to help the people that it's going to impact the most. And that's a little bit more difficult to parse out than I think you would. Then there's a lot of fear out there, so you want to make sure that you're hearing from the right people that are going to give us the best information on how to move forward.
I have a question about what exactly a warrant would look like, since I've been hearing a little bit on the news that people have been passing warrants on that weren't actually warrants.
Oh, like a fake warrant?
Like a fake warrant.
Yeah.
So is there somewhere that we can find out what a warrant would actually look like if for some reasons?
I think in the Attorney General's, like on their, I think on Instagram, but certainly on their website, they have Know Your Rights trainings. And in that they do, I mean, the biggest distinction, if it's a judicial warrant, will have the court at the top with the judge's signature. Mm-hmm. The administrative warrant are Immigration and Customs Enforcement, DHS, administrative documents.
It's
So,
also in the document by the AG.
yeah, so that's kind of the biggest distinction is a judicial warrant.
Signed by a magistrate. That's what you should be looking for.
So we should know who those people are, essentially.
Well, and then have the court to probably be more easy to identify would be the court. Yeah.
I am generally a big fan of a slow deliberative process for coming up with laws, because you get all of the input and you come up with something that can then stand the test of time. These are not normal times, as both of you have said.
Yeah.
I am strongly supportive now of quick, expedient legal changes, knowing that some things will get broken, and you will need to have to go back and change and go back and change. It certainly looks like the surge in Minneapolis is probably going to be on its way down in the near future, because they're starting to cave into all of the demands of the community with body cameras and everything like that. It's probably just going to stop. They're going to go somewhere else, and they may come here. And if they don't come here next, they're going to come here after that. I would rather have this state be as ready as possible and have as many tools as possible, because this could happen in 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks. I would ask both of you to just move as quickly as possible, get things done, again, knowing that it's not going to be perfect. And then in another 3 months, you're going to have to amend, and you're going to have to amend. That's the better way to protect the community than doing it right, that I know in our legislature sometimes takes years and years and years. Mm-hmm. And even when you're working really quickly, it can still take 12 to 18 months to get something good done. So
I appreciate that and share that in many ways. I also am very mindful with any legislation, but even in these moments, that unintended consequences can be just as devastating. You know, the young 18-year-old boy, I think he was 18, 17-year-old boy from Milford that was kidnapped, he was at Plymouth, right? Had he been moved out of state, his family wouldn't have quick access to him. So again, I totally hear what you're saying, but everything has, and we probably don't need to move as slowly as it's been, for sure. And I think, thankfully, with the governor's announcement last week, I think that put the urgency behind us. Because even filing it as a supplemental bill, like I said, that's a funding bill that we do tend to move relatively quickly on. So I'm hopeful that means that at least some of these pieces that, again, have been around for a lot of time, and it's taking pieces of these bills that maybe some of it won't be effective or good, but let's get the good stuff and get it moving and get it done. So I'm hoping that there's... The other thing I want to point out, and again, the reality, there's also a difference between ICE standard enforcement efforts and what we're seeing in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. Nobody that has been killed has been a target of an ICE enforcement, right? And so there's, if and when that does come to our community, that's a whole different ballgame in terms of what laws are there to protect, what the police are doing to protect residents. That's a conversation we all need to be having with our local police departments. There's a very different thing between protesters being protected to their First Amendment right to protest and observe and record, versus, what it means when we're talking about these very specific ways to protect immigrants who are trying to go to court and are getting, kidnapped from there or go to school. So I think that's just, I just want to name that's a distinction that we're also thinking about. And that's going to be not necessarily be a law. It's going to be what happens when it hits, hits the streets. And
it'll be, Massachusetts has had a couple of surges already.
Yeah.
The next surge will not look like the prior surges because of the way things are ramping up everywhere else.
Exactly.
And Mitch, just to add to that, I never want to predict fast movement by the legislature, but I will say the fact that the House is having these caucus-wide meetings, I think that's been reported in the news, the fact that they're making a point to call in every single legislator to Beacon Hill to talk about, or every single House member, I should say, to talk about this, the fact that both the Senate and the House have held press conferences talking about legislation that they just proposed last week. The fact that we're all here tonight does help move this process faster.
Great to hear.
Right? We do move very deliberatively, but when there is a push, enough people pushing, then that does get the ball rolling a little faster. So I definitely appreciate your point of this is not a time to, this is a time to act quickly. And I just to kind of give you some assurances, and the fact that what you were doing matter, the fact that the senator and I can go to Beacon Hill and tell our colleagues we had a packed house in Berlin, Massachusetts, speaks to the fact that this is an issue that a lot of people want to see us take action on sooner rather than later.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I'm hearing from you is that you lack information, and that you maybe don't have a sense of what unintended consequences are, what works. Who are you speaking with to try to gather that information? Are you speaking with people who this is currently happening in Minnesota? Are you speaking with other experts in the state, the community? How are you trying to gain that information so you can make educated decisions?
Some of it is conversations we have with our colleagues, with our legal counsel, right? Like some of the gray area we're in is we've not been in a situation, at least in my lifetime, where we're having to figure out how to navigate and deal with a federal government that is violating the Constitution, and how what ways we can legally act as a state that is effective. And some of it is kind of like I said before, is gathering information from various advocacy groups that are dealing with the people most effective in terms of what actions we can take that will have a tangible way to protect the people that we're trying to. And then some of it is kind of what Mitch was speaking to, like the questions that we have to answer. It's not about talking to certain people, it's decisions we have to make on what actions we as a state do that may be struck down by the Supreme Court, that may incur the ire of the federal government, but may be worth taking anyway. So it's not necessarily, I guess in my opinion, it's not like researching this information, it's trying to kind of figure out based on the best available expertise information that we have, but based on legal precedent, both state and federal, that's going to dictate what actions we can take, and even kind of paying attention to what's happening in other states. I know there was I think a lot of you emailed us about a bill regarding, I think the masking, the law enforcement prohibiting them from being masked. And I apologize if I'm messing this up. California passed that law, I believe, in November, December. That now is on hold because it's being taken up by the Supreme Court, and they issued an injunction, meaning that they cannot move forward until the decision is made. What that does is that even if we were to pass this same exact law in Massachusetts tomorrow, it would be under a similar injunction based on the decision at hand with the Supreme Court. So some of it is kind of getting a lay of the land, figuring out the legal landscape, and then moving from there. So.
Yeah, and I would just add into that just a couple things in terms of kind of what the Senate's doing, because there's much fewer of us, so we can have these conversations in a different way. But in the Senate, we have our steering committee is what they're reframing as Response 2025, and so not just in immigration, but in a multitude of different ways, figuring out the SHIELD Act came out of that, protecting folks that come here for reproductive or gender-affirming care, to look at kind of what out of bills that are pending, what can be pulled that's directly responding to what's happening. And one of my colleagues, Senator Pavel Payano from Lawrence, is the point on the immigration. So he's been working kind of intensely over the past several months on like what are the pieces what is the holdup on some of these bills that have been around forever that's a legitimate issue or problem, and trying to navigate. I'm meeting with our district attorney with him so that he can hear. But I think just to kind of play out how it goes, I work very closely with some of the Luce organizers in Worcester. They're the ones that raise to me like where they see the biggest amount of ICE activity is around the courts. And so looking at two different ways of looking at some prohibitions, and then looking at remote capacity, right? Using remote to have more kind of standard. And so I looked into and my team, to be clear, we looked into what's happening right now, what exists with the trial courts, within the trial court, and every court within the trial court has a different standard for different reasons that you can apply for remote. And so looking at that and seeing how it could be strengthened. And then with Senator Eldridge, I met with the trial courts to say, like, what are you doing? Because again, they're a different branch. And so like, what are you doing around some of this stuff? What could we do? Because Connecticut, their trial courts took the lead on making some of these changes around prohibiting access for a civil arrest within the courts. And then they also updated there in Connecticut, and then the legislature followed suit, so that would be codified in law. And so working with the trial courts to see what they're doing, and then how do we figure out. And then my colleague, Lydia Edwards, who was also doing that same type of work, ended up filing legislation to prohibit, without a judicial warrant, any arrest on court property.
This would be state courts.
State courts, for sure. Yeah, we don't have control over the federal courts. But so that's kind of how that's how we can get information to me, the people that are doing the work, telling us what are the challenges that they're seeing, and then figuring out like, okay, then who are the other stakeholders in this that we have to get a sense of, how do we do this quickly but the right way, right? And make it more, because it's not just criminal court. If you're going to housing court or if you're going to probate court, that you still could get, picked up. And so it should be easier to just do more of those hearings. And so the trial court is working on streamlining their policies around that so that it's a little bit more accessible.
So what is the significance of Governor Healy's announcement last week? If these have all been pretty much around for a long time, how are they going to move forward? What's the process?
So she did file the executive order, which goes into effect right away.
Yeah.
And I think there was a third. Let me check my notes because I know there was a third piece to it. It was so no additional 287G agreements.
So there's currently no, I think, 287G agreements in the state now,
We're not-
correct?
we're not talking about the
But after the executive
So
order,
Plymouth.
Plymouth is still there.
The court
Okay.
to. I mean,
Yeah.
We're talking about the proposed legislation.
So the governor can't put those into effect right now. So the governor's executive action, she's limited on what she can do without legislative approval. So the things that she did was what she could do within her power that didn't need approval from us to get done.
Prohibiting ICE from making civil arrests in non-public areas of state facilities.
So what is the process for the other things that she can't do with the?
Well, she filed it as legislation, which is, again, it's a little complicated because it's outside sections of the supplemental budget. And typically the House takes up the supplemental budget's bills first. So she filed the bill with the House first, and then it'll come to the Senate. So
Yeah.
it's now with us to take up.
But did I understand incorrectly then that, I thought before that I heard somebody say that this legislation has been around for a long time?
Not hers, other
It's-
bills.
Yeah, so
There's
there's
been,
bills that have been filed for several sessions that haven't gotten over the finish line in terms of getting signed into law. So, Mitch was kind of alluding to this earlier about it can take a long time and a lot of advocacy to get a bill right. So when I was referencing, there's certain bills that have been filed for Safe Communities, I guess is a good example. It was filed during the Obama administration. And it has been proposed since, so it's probably on year, 15 now.
But that isn't one of the things that.
No, she did not.
So I'm talking about what she addressed, so there were 4 items, for instance, safe spaces. I mean, she didn't just introduce that, hasn't that been around for a while?
was she?
Not being able to go into churches and schools.
No, she just filed that last week.
That's brand new now.
Because that used to be a federal policy up until the Trump administration a couple months ago decided that was no longer going to be federal policy. And so she introduced, that was part of the bill. Now, part of the other parts of the bills that she filed, some of them she did pick from bills that have been pending for a long time. So part of what she's doing is kind of reinvigorating some of the bills that have been stagnant for some time. This is now her, because there's bills filed in the House, there's bills filed in the Senate. Now this is her legislation on immigration, support and
It
protections.
still has to get through the House and the Senate.
Correct.
So when the governor says get something done, she puts something out there for you, it behooves you to get that thing done. You're facing, it's not a complicated situation, it's simple. You're facing an army of thugs that have been loosed on the population of the United States who have no rules or moral constraints. They kill people without reason. They take people out of their houses without reason. And if you don't treat it as if we're being invaded by terrorists, then you're not doing the job.
So going back to the lawless thing, I understand it's a difficult problem when you have federal agents breaking federal law. So how does this state stop that? The only thing I've seen from around the country that might address that is Governor Pritzker created a commission. I don't remember the exact name, but the idea is basically preserve the evidence, because someday there'll be a different administration with a different attorney general, and these crimes, serious crimes like killing American citizens in the streets, do not have statutes of limitations. So by having a law on the books, you're really just serving the agents doing that work right now, that you will be held accountable someday, and we will preserve this evidence. We can talk to witnesses, we can collect the testimony, sworn testimony, and we can keep it.
Yeah.
Has that been discussed?
I was trying to think of that. So did Minnesota do a similar thing too? Or was it Illinois?
Perhaps.
Is it Illinois? I don't think it's a bad idea. I thought I'd seen the Attorney General maybe do something, but don't quote me on that. But it's certainly something I think is a valuable tool to have, because if nothing else,
What's the risk? What's the potential downside of that?
I can't think of any.
Crime sounds like a really good idea.
Yeah.
And I understand, you think at first when you hear it, well, we're gonna have to wait, years for justice. But it's if agents really see that law and they are reminded that, we're keeping all this, all these body cams, whatever, you say footage, all that is being preserved by the state. We are gonna get you.
Yeah.
So is it a job of the executive branch attorney general's office or a job of the legislature?
Well, I'm just thinking about this like off my head. Like we have body cams, like law enforcement does have cameras, but I think, and was this the Governor Pritzker thing where if it's like individual, maybe it was Minnesota, I can't remember, but
it's collecting the evidence.
Yeah, like if individuals saw something too, like
access it.
and wasn't it something where if like you saw something as an individual or witnessed something, you could log it? Yeah.
It's collecting it from social media, and there is resources required. So where legislature is concerned, you guys can fund stuff.
So they created a data system that is collecting the.
It was a commission, so the commission was going to have resources to collect and preserve all the evidence.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely something that we should be exploring. I haven't heard of that yet. And I will say, just in the context to something that the rep was saying too, that unfortunately, I think for a lot of folks and a lot of legislators, probably from feedback in their district, like that this just wasn't the level of urgency. I think Minneapolis has changed that for everybody. And I think even the conversations that we've had in the Senate and Rep. Kilcoyne has referenced that is happening in the House, that, and again, I emphasize that's not based on, like, there's no local law enforcement isn't what's happening in Minneapolis, right? They're not following up on enforcement of state laws. And so, but I think that has changed the urgency for those that maybe didn't have that beforehand. Around these issues, and I think that it's brought it to a whole different level of, and again, different of what happens when they're rolling tanks into our neighborhoods or showing up, en masse in the hundreds and thousands, not just doing these individual, because again, those are happening every single day still, individual enforcement here in Massachusetts, in our communities, and so. But again, the video, what we've seen come out of Minneapolis, I think has just really changed people. Yeah.
Although it's not a legislative issue per se, it may well become when it comes to judicial versus administrative warrants. In a lot of other cases in which the Trump regime has done things that are appalling, the state's attorney generals have gotten together and filed an immediate injunction with federal court. In some cases, that has preceded pursuing legislation in a parallel way. Why? Well, I'm not aware of it, but has that been done, and if not, why? In the case of...
Well, it has in other places like LA, when he was going to when he called up the National Guard, there was an injunction filed. So some of it, and it does happen, and I think the Attorney General has, I think she said, as of late, 42 pending injunctions that she's part of with amicus brief she's part of with other attorneys general in other parts of the country. So I think that she's not giving an inch when there's something to file against.
It certainly isn't visible. I mean, I would think that a gross violation of the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution by a memo from somebody 2 levels down in an individual position in the executive branch can supersede the Constitution, and nobody is jumping on the Supreme Court.
Yeah. No, and I think and I don't want to speak for the Attorney General because I'm not an attorney for starters, but getting evidence of when it is happening so that they can use that as the case itself.
They have to have standing too.
Yeah.
That was a leaked memo.
Yeah. Just because there's a memo doesn't mean it's.
We can't file a.
You have to have a case of controversy come to the Attorney General's attention. Then you can start to go to the federal court.
So if they can
And
send.
RAG has been part of the group of 23 or 24
Right.
AGs across the country were challenging, regular challenging. But you're right. Is there an opportunity for state legislation behind those challenges to hold up states' rights and put us in a
I mean,
position?
I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I will say, in terms of interacting with the Supreme Court decisions, right? We've typically, and this usually pertains to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, especially as it pertains to firearms, because we've taken a more defensive approach. Because the fear was, if we preemptively tried to legislate around what the Supreme Court was going to say, they could then craft their opinion to strike down what we were trying to do. We've seen this a lot since the Trump administration, especially as it pertains to our gun laws, because the Trump administration, I don't think this has gotten as much coverage, but they actively want to try to go after states that have what are called a may issue state, which we are, right? In Massachusetts, you don't automatically get a firearm. You need to apply for a license, which may be refused based on certain threats that you might have to public safety. So there was a Bruin decision, I believe. I might be misremembering that name. I didn't come prepared on talking about the firearm Supreme Court decisions, but this was in, I think, 2022 that they the Supreme Court issued a decision that basically would jeopardize the laws that we had here, primarily our suitable person standard that we've been using since 1900, mind you. That's when the origins of that law was in place in the state. So we waited for that decision because we wanted to make sure that when we strengthened our laws, we were doing so in a way that wasn't going to be jeopardized by court precedent that would automatically lead to legal challenges from the other side. So a reason that we don't necessarily want to, and I don't want to speak for the House or the Senate, this is just what I've observed. A reason you may not want to preemptively try to get ahead of what the Supreme Court is going to say is because you might craft a law that not only could be upended by what a decision is, but it also leaves you vulnerable to other challenges based on what other groups might have. Massachusetts is not a one-party state, despite what Republicans might say, or other people outside of this Commonwealth might say. There would be challenges to a law that if we don't craft a law that is in response, or responsive, I should say, to legal precedent, that does open us up to other legal challenges from the opposite side of the spectrum. So I feel like, I'm sorry, that's a very convoluted way of trying to have this to respond.
I think it's very frustrating to see perhaps the grossest violation of the Constitution.
Right, but
Most
what we...
blatant, clear violation, and we're thinking about it.
What should be happening is the DOJ should be filing on behalf of the people to the federal government.
Right.
That's what should be happening, and it's not, and it's really frustrating. But we can't file. The Massachusetts Attorney General, to my knowledge, cannot file something on behalf of what is happening in Minnesota unless it.
All they have to do is find it happening here once.
It has to happen here, which God,
I'm sure
hopefully it won't.
Well, we're waiting.
Well, this all brings us back around to, if we can't get ahead of things, we're going to have to build move quickly. I'm encouraged to hear that the State House is recognizing the urgency of the situation right now. I was wondering if you could recap what steps the legislature is taking in order to make sure that bills do cross the finish line. Key bills on these issues are going to cross the finish line.
Just like what is happening in terms of immigration law, or just in general?
What structural changes are you doing? I know you're talking more as a legislature about the immigration issue. How are you making sure that these bills move a little bit faster than they maybe have in the past? What steps are you taking?
I think one of the biggest things that changed this year was in our joint rules that allows bills to stay within the chamber that they originated in. So previously, if bills were, mirror bills were filed in the House and the Senate, they'd get matched together and sent to one chamber or the other. Starting this session, we're able to send them on their separate, stay within their chamber, which I think what we've seen is now in the House and the Senate, we're passing a lot more smaller bills more quickly, not waiting for the other. And then now that we're in the second year of session, because we just entered the second year of session, hearings got moved up. So the deadline for hearings was in December. So now things are going to be able, this whole second year, to be able to start now matching the bills and filing a lot. So I think that's, broadly speaking, I think that's going to turn out to be really helpful in being able to get a lot more done. But I think, continuing to push, like I said, in the Senate, we have the steering committee that's what their focus is. And I think you mentioned you're having individual conversations with leadership. And so that's what we can do, is keep raising it, keep pushing it. When we meet in caucus in the legislature, we have a Democratic caucus that meets. I speak about it. I talk about these issues. I say, I want to vote. I personally want to test the bounds of legal, if we have to, get sued on something that we do, if that's going to help push. I also think, we continue to do the things that may not be as flashy or as attention grabbing. I think one of the most effective things we did as a state was we formally withdrew all of our petitions that were pending before the Convention of States, which is something that anytime we want to challenge the U.S. Constitution, a state can file a petition, and then at some point they can call a Convention of States to review the Constitution. We were the last state, and because we withdrew our petitions, now they don't have a majority to be able to call for a convention, which may seem like bureaucratic and useless, but it could open up the Constitution. So everything we're talking about, we now prohibited that from happening because we were not the last state that would do it, but because of, I forget the majority number. I think we were 60. I think it's 2/3 of the state. I forget that exact number off the top of my head. But the number that did this action, there were several states that preceded us, but because we did this, now they can't call a convention of states because they don't have a majority of the states with petitions pending. And so, again, we're trying to find also the creative levers that we can pull that can actually, again, seem a little bit more bureaucratic.
Yeah.
But that would be...
That was actually the legislature.
Correct.
The petitions back, you need 3/4 of the states, 2/3 of the federal Congress.
There you go. So we were the 23rd state or something. That's it.
Well,
whatever the number is.
38 they need, so we were 37, 38.
Yes, we were the last. All I know is we were the last state that did it, whatever the number is. But again, trying to figure out where are all these levers that we can actually pull that can actually protect our residents, and then where are some levers we might need to pull and hope it stays and works.
Yeah, I mean, we did do some, like the senator said, some structural changes on both chambers to get bills moving quicker. Committees have a shorter deadline to report out bills, but I think it is kind of one of those things where this is a little bit unique in that, we weren't having this conversation, unfortunately, 6 months ago regarding immigration policy. So, I mean, sometimes the legislative agenda gets dictated by what is happening on the ground, what we're hearing on the ground from our districts, in this case, what's happening nationally and how that impacts here in the Commonwealth. So, I mean, I think we certainly have made some changes because I know that people want to see things move a little quicker in the legislature. But what we're seeing happening now, I think, is a little bit independent of that because of what people are witnessing, happening across the United States.
I'm from Minnesota, by the way.
Yeah, we can hear it.
Well, you bet. And my heart was broken over how my family and friends and fellow citizens there are being treated. I don't want that to come here.
Yeah.
But I just want to make sure that we never forget. I'll add one thing to that. I was drafted before I was eligible to vote because the voting age was 21.
Yeah.
I was sent to Vietnam and returned before I was eligible to vote. And I was changed. Probably not in a good way. But I am adamant about getting people out to vote.
Same-day voter registration is something that people are looking at in the legislature in Massachusetts right now. It's not Minnesota, it's not Iowa, it's here in Massachusetts. We do pretty well at voting, but same-day registration would help a lot for, there's a cohort of people that the idea of checking your voter registration status is just overwhelming because of jobs and obligations that people have. Mm-hmm. And the same day, being able to register on the polling day is really helpful for people that accidentally and inadvertently, I mean, people in their 20s and 30s don't read their postal mail. Mm-hmm. And and we do an annual census here, and if you have a gap in voting, you're not going to be registered to vote when you show up on election day. So this is something that we can do here, the same day registration.
I know our main focus, rightfully so, has been on immigration, but of course, nationally and statewide and locally is still affordability. I know the governor made an important move with the energy costs, but maybe you can briefly tell us where the legislature is on anything else that might be beneficial to basic
Could you
residents.
speak up, please?
Yeah, could you just describe what measures you see coming before your bodies this year for affordability that might, again, be helpful for residents that are still struggling?
I think that there's been a lot of attention and conversation about energy legislation that prior to the events that we're seeing nationally was kind of the big conversation piece in the House. We were initially, the House was going to take that up in November, and it rightfully, I think, got put on ice. Oh my God, no, put on top of. There were concerns from environmental groups that were raised and were heard, and so we put a pause, which is a much better phrase to use here, to look more carefully at it and make sure we're balancing on how we can better try to bring some relief to energy costs while also maintaining climate goals that we're trying to achieve here in the Commonwealth in regards to green energy. I'm sure everybody has seen their heating bill. Mine has been, crazy this winter. We've had an incredibly frigid, freezing cold winter. So that has been, I think, that's going to be something that I think we'll see in the House shortly. I would say the other big thing that we're going to have to take a look at is healthcare costs in the Commonwealth. That's, again, another problem being exacerbated by the federal government and the big, beautiful bill. And I think there's real concerns over the impact that law is going to have on especially healthcare subsidies here in the state. And we're going to have to figure out a way to make sure that our residents can continue to access healthcare coverage and find a way to try to make sure healthcare costs are manageable. And those are two areas that I know that a lot of the focus should be on. I don't know if Senator Kennedy, you guys have had.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, I think, we're going after the utility companies just in that vein. I don't know if you all saw the governor's announcement to allow to cap the costs, but then defer them to later months. The energy companies were proposing a interest to charge on that. And so I think unanimously we signed on to a letter pushing back to say, so we're paying attention to the details, I'll just say, in terms of how to address energy costs there. I think this, although some of my local government officials might support this, but one of the big things I'm pushing for this year is UGA, which is Unrestricted Government General Aid Reform, because so much that we need to get to the municipalities in terms of additional support so that they can take pressures off of the property taxes. And we just 2 weeks ago in the Senate passed a few different measures to particularly address property tax for elders in our community or people living on fixed income with disabilities, et cetera. Except you had to have reserves as your municipality to be able to do that. And you can imagine what cities do have reserves, like Boston and other wealthier communities that are going to be able to pass that tax relief on to their residents. And so as I've been diving into it, looking at how UGA, which doesn't have any methodology or any formula for how it's distributed, Boston gets $235 million. Worcester, the second largest city, gets $51 million. And you can say there's more people, but when you look at the numbers, in Boston, it amounts to about $325 per person. And I know the other number I have off the top of my head is Bolton is $41 per person in terms of the UGA. So we have disproportionately benefited the eastern part of the state for generations. And so, and again, that sounds, bigger and not necessarily direct relief, but until we can give municipalities the tools so that they're not doing overrides every year. 98 communities did overrides last year for operations. 98 communities had to ask their taxpayers to pay more just to keep libraries and town halls and municipal services open. And so we need to be better about how we're equitably distributing state funds so that a lot of the pressure, which we know particularly for aging communities, property taxes are the worst type of tax assessment to have. And so figuring that out. So again, I know it sounds bureaucratic, like in the weeds on things, but I think that being able to reform that is actually could have a big impact in making sure that municipalities are not tying the hands of their residents.
And to that end, too, just to kind of piggyback on the senator, we're about to get into the budget conversation and budget debate, and now pretty much we're going to start. We're both the senator and I are on the Ways and Means Committee in the House and Senate, respectively, and we're going to start holding hearings. We're going to start looking at hearing from different agencies on their budget needs. It will be a challenging budget cycle, but in terms of affordability, that's going to be sort of the most immediate way that we can try to address some of these issues with our limited resources. So, like for instance, kind of similar to the unrestricted local aid, talking about regional school funding, Chapter 70 funding, education funding, things that are going to go directly towards, impacting town budgets. While it doesn't speak to maybe longer term conversations in terms of reform on some of these things, it will be an opportunity to figure out how we can, I guess, put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, both on addressing affordability needs, but also, last year in the budget, before even some of this Minnesota stuff ramped up, we put, and I think you referenced this earlier, Senator, $5 million or so to legal defense aid for immigration. So, I mean, that's an example that, while it's kind of a small Band-Aid, but an important one in providing relief to those people that need it the most in the Commonwealth.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I did just want to note that Senator Kennedy and Representative Kilcoyne came into the select board and talked about a lot of these issues, which will be on YouTube if anybody wants to go see stuff about Chapter 70, Chapter 90, and basic government aid.
Was that tonight?
It was...
No, that'd be quite a night.
Yeah, we do love Berlin.
Yeah.
Circling back to what AJ said, that we, talking about laws that are on the books now, bills that are being presented and so forth. But the bottom line in Minnesota is that the people of Minnesota came out. And we have to be ready to do the same thing.
Yes.
It's that simple. It's that simple.
You said that you were, you seemed surprised that you got a group this large in Bolton.
Well, we're in Berlin, but honestly, yeah. I mean, I represent 6 communities. So Clinton, Sterling, Lancaster, here, Boylston, Northborough. Parts of my districts, we would fill an equally sized room with people that wanted to, tell me exactly how everything Trump is doing is great. We don't live in a community where it is a monolith politically. It is important for all of you to show up tonight to make sure that we know that these are issues that we can push for hard at Beacon Hill. Because we have it's not just about how we feel about certain issues, we're here to represent our communities. Not to say that we have if we listen to every single person, we wouldn't have any, opinions at all. But it is important for us to understand where our community feels about things, where people lie on certain issues. Because believe me, I am hearing from a different part of the district the opposite of what we are hearing here today.
So besides this, like to influence your colleagues, I mean, a lot of us belong to indivisible groups, and we have various ways that we express our positions. One is you see all the rallies, right?
You should still reach out individually to them, because some of you are not. We don't represent you actually. You have a different. You might be. Is everybody in your district here?
Shrewsbury.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I have Cronin, you.
Yeah, I don't have Clinton.
Yeah.
I don't have Shrewsbury. Somebody who's from Shrewsbury.
Yeah, I represent you though, so, so no worries.
But Berlin, Bolton.
Yeah.
Northborough.
Things that they have to be able to communicate. Does that kind of stuff work? Or?
I would encourage you. I always want to make sure I'm meeting people where they are. I understand that it can be very hard and intimidating sometimes to reach out to an elected official, but I know my inbox gets inundated with what we call them one-click emails. I find it much more meaningful if you're willing to the more personal you can make it, the better. Whether that's a personalized email you sit down and write, whether it's a phone call, whether it's coming to something like this, whether it's going to office hours. To give you an example of why the one-clicks, while good, we certainly track them, we pay attention to them, especially the number that we're getting. But like my dad, for instance, will send me one-click emails, and he sends them, he signs his name and his address. And then when I ask him about it later, first of all, like, Dad, you have my cell phone number. And then half the time he's like, oh, I didn't know. He didn't even know he emailed me. Like somebody sent him a link and he just clicked on it. So sometimes like there is, and that is not the only time that's happened. Like that happened, I was with a group in Sterling, and I was going to this group, and you know them, our Sterling people, and one of the members had emailed me this, but they signed it a name of someone else who was going to be there. So I went, and I was like, which one of you sent this email? And neither of them had any clue who sent it. So all that is to say, the one-clicks, I think, can get a little fuzzy because people can click on like a button or like a link, and it sends off an email and it puts your information out there, and it's indicative if someone is like, I support this or I don't support this. But I do find that if there's a specific issue that you care about and you want to have a conversation, try to make it as personal as possible, because it helps us know how to prioritize reaching out to some of these folks. Because the one click sometimes will get like 200 in 10 minutes, and they get a response, but it's not going to reach the level of priority that if someone is calling or sending a personal response.
If you don't need, you don't want to have a conversation with every one of us about
Well, that's why we got in this business,
Yeah.
I guess.
I mean, we have office hours. We have different ways in which you can share what you, and I think it's important. I say the same thing all the time. If it's a personal email, I respond back directly. If it's a one-click, I get hundreds. I couldn't possibly respond to them all, like just time-wise. And so I take note of what's coming in and what people are saying, but the personal, and and I think this kind of goes to Jim's concerns too, of like, if I was to put a issue on the floor here today, right now, I guarantee you everyone in this room would have a different perspective on it. You might philosophically agree with the broader goal or broader issue, but every single one of you are going to have a different opinion on how to get. That's legislation, right? That's the process. And so for us to be able to hear and to say, okay, A, does this align with my values because you elect me, but I come with my own set of human values, and so and then does this represent my district and the needs of my district, and then does this represent the voice of my district and what people are telling me that they care about or don't care about, and so it is really important on that. The other thing, just going back to the ballot questions, I just want to end with of just, I appreciate it may be a statement of folks' concerns, but do your homework on where these ballot questions are coming from.
Yeah.
Because they're not all good intentions. And quite frankly, the ballot question that will roll back the income tax will devastate our budget. We're talking $4.5 billion, and that's being funded and run by billionaires in our state that are pissed that we passed the millionaires tax.
Yeah.
So, I get it. There's a statement there, and there's some lessons that we need to be hearing and taking from what people are putting forward. There's some good things like the rent control measure, that there is legislation that might spark us to move on some of that legislation. I just want to say that it's there. Do the due diligence of who's funding these initiatives, who's behind them, who's working on them, because it may surprise you when you actually look into kind of where these things come from and who's kind of backing those signature collection efforts. And so,
Is that even available?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
You have to report it.
Let me also thank you for your response. You always reply.
Yes. You're my most frequent, I think, emailer. I have a.
Thanks for showing up for our protests.
Yes.
Big time.
Always. Yeah. No, and that's, it's going to take all of us. I mean, again, I go back and I've said it 1,000 times over. These are not normal times that we're in. Our country has seen terrible times like this before, right? But it's always been people collectively working with elected officials, pushing those who aren't working collectively. But every civil rights battle we've ever had in this country has not been the elected officials that have changed, it's been the people that have pushed for it. So I like to think I'm still part of that in addition to being an elected official, but keep showing up. I'll share the information for the Luce hotline. Again, if you have time, get trained to be an observer, be a verifier. It's not asking you to put yourself in the middle of a battle. It's saying stand there with your camera. Ask the person to tell you their name as they're getting taken so that they can at least help track down who they are and where their family is. And you get full training. They don't send people out just because we don't want to put people in harm's way. So,
just a quick note on Luce. There's other things to do if you're not comfortable being a verifier. There are other roles you can do as well. You can be the hotline operator, but they also do follow up for people who have been taken. They do support the families.
Sure.
So you don't have to be the people out there with the camera.
sure. Or you can drive people to appointments. Like there is, to your point. Absolutely. So, and that's organized by grassroots neighbor community members that are stepping up, and so. And it's confidential, and they're very protective of names and identities and everything. So.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming out on a cold night.